Yes, I know that. No, that was a tall order. That actually was on my own research. The other books were an overview of my field. This one concentrated on my own research, and believe it or not, it was an attempt to write a popular book on irregular and regular verbs. Now, it doesn't sound like a recipe for a bestseller. And I say it falls in the great academic tradition of knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. But I had the idea to write the book because I thought that this was actually could serve as a different entry point, a different rabbit hole, if you want, into the workings of language. The idea was that irregular verbs are things like come, came, break, broke, stink, stank, which are unpredictable and have to be memorized. You only become aware of them when you learn some other language, and the first thing you have to do is you memorize all the irregular conjugations. Whereas a regular verb is something like walk, walked, play, played, where the past tense is predictable. Just add the ed suffix. And though it sounds kind of dry, these, I argued, are examples of the two processes that make language possible, namely memory, which is what we have to do when we learn words. A literate adult knows maybe 100,000 words, each of which had to have been memorized. But of course we don't just blurt out words or cliches or formulas, but we assemble them in real time into sentences using rules. Computational algorithms. And so these two ingredients of language, memory for words, computation for phrases and sentences, I argued are on display in microcosm in the irregular verbs which we memorize and the regular verbs which we compose.
You were quoted some places saying that the most hate mail you've ever gotten is about irregular verbs. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say hate mail, but certainly the biggest academic controversies. Yeah, it gets ugly in the ivory tower.
And then The Blank Slate, 2002.
That was on the concept of human nature. And I was pushed to write that in part because of some of the reactions that I got to how the mind works, where there were objections, both from the left and from the right, that were as political and moral as they were scientific. That the idea of an inborn human nature rooted in the biology of the brain, in turn rooted in genetics and evolution, is an idea that strikes people as uncomfortable, even dangerous. And so I wanted to, so much of the criticism from how the mind works was on these foundational, almost philosophical issues that I thought they had to be addressed. And for the political left, there are fears of innate biological differences. If men and women aren't identical biologically, will that set the cause of women's progress back? Racial differences, individual differences, do some people succeed more than others in society, not because of prejudice, but because they're smarter or harder working than others? That seems like a challenge to egalitarian ideals. Perfectibility, can we design a utopian society when we raise children without selfishness and violence, or will selfishness and violence always be part of human nature and therefore have to be dealt with by some kind of punitive method? Those are concerns from the left. From the right, there are concerns if we're really products of evolution, does that just mean that we selfishly try to propagate our genes and are deaf to higher moral callings? Does it mean that the foundations of religion, such as scriptures, have to be thrown out, including all the moral stuff, like the Ten Commandments, if the story of how we came to be turns out to be incorrect? Will there be infinite Twinkie defenses, excuses for bad behavior? My genes made me do it, my evolutionary history made me do it, so we can never hold people morally responsible. So there's this whole can of worms that's opened when you study human mind from a biological framework, and The Blank Slate was about those worms.
And who is the opposition? In opposition is maybe not the right word. Who would most likely be the people who would disagree with you most right now? I'm talking about the scientists who are working in this field.
And so not these political and moral?
Not the political. Well, in the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, in the political and moral sphere, there's the politically correct left that doesn't want to admit the possibility of any human differences. There's also the, I guess I can call it the politically correct right, because it's a different kind of political correctness, but the pro-religion, family values, traditional mores, sometimes seem to be in opposition to an evolutionary or biological framework. Within academia, there are people who want to attribute more to the environment than I do, people who work in neural network modeling, who try to devise models that soak up correlations of information in the environment and try to get away with less pre-programming. There are people who believe in that the mind has less structure than I would be willing to attribute. That is, that it's less organized into subsystems or modules or mental organs, and rather that we have one all-purpose learning device that we use for everything. So that's some of the opposition.
Last year, this book, The Stuff of Thought, we get really into the language part.
Yes.
What were you trying to do?
This tried to combine my interest in language with my interest in human nature. What can we learn about human nature through language? And not through language as in the language instinct of how language itself works. What are the gears and belts and pulleys that allow us to put words together? But this one looks at meaning. What do words mean? What do sentences mean? How do we use words in social interaction? What can we learn about, say, the human concept of space and time from words like prepositions and past, present, future tense, which are about space and time? What can we learn about causality, the human concept of causality, from the way we use verbs? And even in later chapters, I switched from cognition to emotion and social relationships. What can we learn about human emotion from swearing? And why are some words swear words, and why do we swear in such bizarre ways? And innuendo. Why don't we say what we mean? Why do we constantly veil our intentions in euphemism and doublespeak and innuendo and taboo? Why do I say, would you like to come up and see my etchings instead of do you want to have sex? Why do I say, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome, instead of give me the salt? And I use that euphemism and innuendo as a way of probing our social interactions.
Well, this is a political network, so let's dive into that whole issue of how politicians and lawmakers use language to their benefit. You looked at this in this book, and in some of your other works too. What did you find?
Well, a number of phenomena go on in the crafting of language to political purposes. One of them is innuendo and euphemism. That is, if anything you say as a politician has some danger of alienating some constituency, how do you say something that will alienate the fewest as possible? And you're forced often to vaguer and vaguer, windier and loftier and emptier speech. The most you could hope for is what's sometimes called dog whistle rhetoric, namely messages that are pitched at such a high level that only certain constituencies can hear them. They know you're talking to them, but other people don't know what you're talking about, and so you can get them into your camp without alienating the people who don't know that you're using code words for one thing or another. So you have empty things like change. Who could be against change? But of course, what the change is very much depends on your orientation in the first place. When you have a politician who deviates from that formula, being vague and empty, you have what we know as the gaffe. And Michael Kinsley had the classic definition of a political gaffe. A gaffe in Washington is when a politician says something that's true. And it is the reason we're all hypocrites, in the sense that we complain about politicians' empty rhetoric, but on the other hand, as soon as they speak honestly, then that's what the journalists pounce on. Joe Biden being the famous example. And because a lot of political journalism consists of waiting for the gaffe, that puts a pressure on politicians to avoid gaffes by avoiding saying anything.
I have a quote from you here. We're forcing politicians to give us more empty rhetoric.
Yes. I think what a lot of political coverage ends up doing.
And is that evolved, or has that always been there?
I suspect it's always been there. It may have gotten, you have a sense that it's gotten worse in the last 10, 15 years, but I suspect it's always been